everybody.
Hello.
It's Andy and Aaron here. Brent's in the background. He's not. Hi, Brent.
Cameraman.
So we're trying out different ways to get the conversation going amongst our members. We've had some suggestions to do that, and we've been out doing school visits, and they've been going very well. Just as an aside, Andy and I listen to a podcast called Armchair Experts, so we are armchairies for those people who are fans. But that just means that we talk about topics, so we're not experts really on anything, we just talk about things through our lens, and so these are just really conversations that we're having. And so in the first time we're trying this, we thought it might be a good idea to talk about the press conference that Minister Stephen Lecce had yesterday. So for those of you that don't know, he's the current Minister of Education, and he's a very good speaker. And the announcement yesterday was where the government tried to convince the public that they were backing off on the 28-to-1 funding generator to 25-to-1. So obviously that fired us up a bit because we know there's a little bit of a different reality to what that means, because currently our school board was funded at 22-to-1 and all the rest of the other school boards were funded at 22.5-to-1. So still moving from 28 to 25 is still a significant increase. So we were a little fired up about that conference yesterday that we were watching, and Andy went and wrote down a bunch of quotes that the Minister of Education said, and we wanted to kind of go over those because they certainly fired us up, and we want to talk about why they did.
Absolutely. I mean, I remember watching it and thinking somebody's got to call them out. I do want to give kudos out to the reporters yesterday. I think they did a much better job than all the other press conferences. You could tell that the minister was a little bit taken aback from some of the questions that were asked. So we had a few other questions, some of the quotes that he...
I'm going to say that if you want some good viewing, you should watch the press conference yourself, but buckle up and get some popcorn because you're going to go on an emotional ride like we did. So.
Very awesome. All right, well, back to me. I'd like to use some of the quotes I wrote down and tell you what I wish I could have asked him in the moment. And I don't think it's fair that he gets to say what he wants to say and then walk away from it. So a couple of the quotes to start off here. And I think the theme was that OSSTF wasn't being reasonable and that the government is the reasonable party at the table and that somehow we're the barrier to coming up with a fair deal. So a couple quotes to start off here. And while there is a continued challenge at the table focused around, in part, compensation and benefits, I do acknowledge that government can and should go further to incent a deal that keeps kids in class. That right before he said, we have been bargaining every day in good faith since the beginning of this process. And I call BS on that. And the reason I do is because compensation and benefits, he says the government should go further to incent a deal. However, they tabled legislation to put a maximum increase to salary and compensation of 1%. And that was done before our contracts were up and before we were actually negotiating it at the table. So
can I say the minister says negotiating? So we'll use the term negotiate, but he does in his conference over and over say negotiate.
He does. This is true. I didn't know that we would go there, but that's okay. So in terms of good faith bargaining, if we're bargaining salaries and compensations at the table, and that's what he continues to bring up. Yesterday's press conference, two major points. One was the 22-to-1 moving to 28-to-1, which he never once made mention of. And then in his words and spin, reducing from 28-to-1 to 25-to-1, which we're all calling BS on. But and I think our provincial president has done that extremely well in the press. But we're here to just kind of add to that. So I think it's very unfair that the minister and his government on March 15th came out and brought a change to the regulation in terms of funding, class size ratios, and tabled legislation about salary and compensation. Both of those things before negotiations took place. They cut local priorities funding, so all the cuts to students that took place before this school year, and I call BS on saying that we aren't the reasonable ones.
So maybe we should do a little role play like we had today. So I'm gonna, we had a nice analogy that we came up on one of our workplace visits. So let's pretend that I'm selling a house for $100,000.
Ah, yes, now I know what she's
So
talking about.
I'm selling it, so this is the way I feel about the government's announcement yesterday. So if I'm selling a house for $100,000 and I'm the seller,
I'd like to make an offer. I'll offer you 10,000.
10,000, that's insulting. Like, I'm sorry, like, I can't accept that. 10,000, that's way too low. My price is pretty firm, and it's 100,000.
Okay, you know what? Let me think about it. I'll make you a deal you can't refuse. I'll give you 40,000.
Maybe you didn't hear me the first time, but I understand that you came up, but no, my price is pretty firm at 100,000.
I think you're being really unreasonable. My side has come and offered you 4 times our original offer, 4 times more, and you're still saying no. You're a problem in this negotiation.
I think it's a good analogy to the way that I felt yesterday when the minister was trying to seem reasonable on moving from 28, which nobody is at, and going down to, and making it seem like to the public that he was being reasonable by moving it to 25, which from my assessment is still pretty devastating to the system.
That's 25 with all local class size maximum language being eliminated. So that 25 to 1 is probably worse than the original 28 to 1 that they proposed. Just saying.
Okay.
All right,
So moving on. We're going to move on to another quote.
All right, got a couple quotes here, a little bit of a different topic. So the minister said, "My lens that's being applied to this is not a fiscal one. It is one focused on students, their own experience, and their betterment." And there was another quote that was in the same line. "We also recognize when it comes to education, or likewise perhaps even healthcare, it isn't about the dollar. It's about the kid. It's about the patient. It's about the end user experience that we seek to enhance."
And this is when Andy and I looked at each other and just went, minds blown that he
Couldn't
could
believe
say
it.
something like that.
Couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it because I kept thinking, well, if it's not about money, if it's not about the fiscal reality, then why did we change from 22 to 1 to 28 to 1? Is he going back to the whole resilient talk? Is that why we're making the change? If it wasn't about money and it's about the kid, I can't understand why these changes were even proposed back in March. It's
And
crazy.
if it's about the user experience, to use his language, the end experience, well, we all know that increased class sizes will diminish the experience of the student. I had this conversation this morning. If I likely have enough seniority to withstand the cuts that they're suggesting, and if I'm back in the classroom and I have a class of 45, that just means that I'm gonna have to give fewer assessments because I have more marking to do and less tests. But then who suffers in that situation? Of course, my workload is increased, but I'm still getting a paycheck. I still have the same vacation. But the experience is the students. The students are going to be the ones that are gonna suffer, and their educational experience overall. And forget me, also trying to do any extracurriculars. Like, that's just the reality.
Sorry, now I'll jump in there. I just want to point out for everybody, here in Greater Essex, we actually staffed at 22 to 1. And we've seen a few cuts in our board, but for the most part, we actually made out pretty good. Aaron did put out an open letter to trustees. I hope everybody gets a chance to read that to kind of emphasize how we made out pretty good down here. But I will say this, the minister is on record of changing the funding to 22 and a half back in August. So this school year was funded at 22 and a half. And I'd like you to think about all the devastation that's taken places. Courses being canceled, kids not getting the courses they need, quad stacked courses. We've got all this going on in the current environment that was funded at 22 and a half to 1. We can't fathom what 25 and a half or 25 to 1 with no limitations, or 28 to 1. All of those things are completely destructive to publicly funded education.
And I think it's laughable for the minister to suggest that this has anything to do other than fiscal realities for this government. They're trying to say it's a cash grab. They're trying to save money on the backs of kids.
No questions asked. All right, we're gonna move on here. So the next topic is something to do with bargaining. So quoting the minister again, "The bargaining reality has changed. My preference has always been, quite frankly, to do it at the table. But given this is their specific request, OSSTF, I'm providing the high-level detail the public ought to know." I'm going to start with that one and say I'm pretty sure OSSTF brought this to the public because the public ought to know. But we didn't bring it to the public first, my friends. I shouldn't have said my friends because now it made me feel like Dougie. But the reality is this. March 15th, this was brought to the public. March 15th, they made the announcement to change funding and the funding ratio from 22-1 to 28-1. They brought this to the public and they cut local priorities funding, and then in the media said, don't worry, the unions can negotiate this later on. They are the ones that cut funding to students and to school boards, not to teachers, and then use those students in this current situation as pawns against us at the negotiating table. Unfair, unfounded, straight up lies.
Certainly. And I just want to remind people when those announcements were made, the Friday of March break. So I'll just explain the reality of what was going on in our, I guess Andy is not my mind at that time. So I was in Legoland in the US with friends of mine and our children because it was March break. And I was getting some comments on the horn because I knew that the Ministry of Education was going to be making some announcements. And when I heard 28-1 and 4 mandatory e-learning credits, like literally the air was sucked out of my lungs. And I was on my phone as my kids are at Legoland and had to apologize to my friend who's not in education to be like, this is something I really need to sink my teeth into, and I'm feeling a little bit upset that this has happened. And even in those moments, I felt like I had to give a response. And Andy happened to be in the office because he tends to be in the office way more than he should, but because he's very hardworking.
Yeah.
But he was here, and so I was able to get him some information, and we were able to get a media release out and have an immediate response on the Monday. If you remember, you may have worn black because we asked you to. So for the government to now say that we brought this to the public, no, we responded by bringing this to the public. We responded because they put it into the public realm.
Sorry, we responded in the public. They brought it into the public.
These announcements were made March 15th. We weren't even able to even give notice to bargain until sometime in late April.
April 29th was the first day that we were legally allowed to give notice, and OSSTF did so on the first day available to us.
So, his entire press conference was about the 28-1 and the 25-1. None of those things that are specifically discussed in bargaining, because we have class size caps in our local collective agreements. And typically we don't have the funding generator. We happen to have 22-1 in our language, but it's not about the regulation itself.
That's right. Shouldn't be negotiating the regulation to start. All right.
So one last one.
That kind of brought up a little sour note, though. I did spend a bit of March break here on that weekend, and I got to tell you on a personal note, I sat down and penned a letter to my members because my heart sank. I couldn't imagine what 28-1 would do to our publicly funded system. I have 3 young children under the age of 10. Aaron's in the same boat. And we couldn't stop talking about what this would do. This is a complete slash of our system. I couldn't stand by and watch this happen, and here we are. It's almost November, or almost October, almost November, and we're still fighting this, and this government needs to understand that we will not back down. The last one I'm going to leave you with was the minister asking my union partners, he asked his union partners, never turn our backs on our kids. Let's always remind ourselves that this negotiation should never impede, should never undermine the success of our students. I'm going to go right back to it and say this government cut funding to students before negotiations began, before our contracts expired. Between the funding ratio, the local priorities funding, and all the bad faith bargaining that's taken place in the public eye before we brought it to the public, that I say we didn't turn our backs on students. You did, Mr. Lecce. And I'll say to you right now that OSSTF, excuse me, along with the other education affiliates, are the only ones standing up for kids right now. We're the only ones that are actually fighting for them. Our proposal that you can find on education, or bargaining for education, go online and see it for yourselves. We are asking for things that protect student learning. We're asking for you to return to 22-1. We're asking for you to pilot e-learning. We're just saying don't make it mandatory across the board. We're not asking for a whole lot. And when it comes to salary, and you keep saying that's the barrier, all we're saying is let us have the same buying power tomorrow that we have today. We're not asking for more than we have. That's all we're doing. And so this right here is maybe the biggest BS in your entire interview or press conference. Sorry.
Completely agree, and Andy summed it up well. If he really did care about kids, then he wouldn't have cut $1,000 from the grants per student needs per kid this year. He wouldn't be making these moves, And any sort of spin that he's trying to convince the public of to say that it's somehow somebody else's fault, this is completely laid at the feet of the government. They have complete control over this situation. And essentially, Andy said it, we're asking for status quo. Go to 22-1, which is something that we've enjoyed for a very, very long time. Pilot mandatory e-learning, and we're asking for structural COLA, which just really is inflation protection. That is not the world. That is just something that we can do to continue to protect our system.
Absolutely. Well, those are the thoughts of these two non-experts, that's for sure.
These armcharies.
These armcharies. Shout out to Dax and Monica.
Yeah.
Who knows, maybe they'll watch it.
Yeah. And we'll see if we have the courage to ever post this. But,
But it feels good doing it, so
Yeah.
if you do see this, well, I guess we got there.
Yeah, we got
Otherwise, it was just for ourselves.
there. Okay, bye.